Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. Mary Kissel, my co-host, is editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, in addition to being the host of Opinion Journal at WSJ.com. It is an unusual night in New York. Early in March, we anticipate the Yankees. Today, we're dealing with yet another blizzard, this one very wet and very, very damaging to people walking around on the streets or using the subways. Mary's at home, which is a very comfortable and secure place to be, so I greet her this evening. Mary, all day long, and yesterday and probably for the next week, we're dealing with a story that comes from out of nowhere. It's a political storm. However, it is also a mystery. Mrs. Clinton, former Secretary of State, former Senator from New York, former First Lady, and her emails. The editorial board of the Wall Street Journal so far has been curious and very careful going forward. Is your sense that this story is growing, Mary? A very good evening to you.
Hi, good evening, John. Yes, my sense is that this story is only going to get bigger, and it's grown by the day. For one thing, this email address has apparently been operational for several years. It's curious that it hasn't been uncovered until now. It's curious that Mrs. Clinton didn't feel the need to comply with her own department's guidelines. The State Department has fairly robust document retention guidelines. And thirdly, if Mrs. Clinton did not think this was a big deal and that it was a growing scandal, she wouldn't have felt compelled to tweet about it and acknowledge it this week. So I look, the Benghazi committee that discovered the bulk of these things and has pursued it, I think, is only just getting started.
We welcome David Drucker of the Washington Examiner in Washington, because while Mary has accurately testified to how New York is regarding this information technology story, after all, we believe at this point, at least there's ambiguous information to point to the fact that the address for the email was Mrs. Clinton's address in Chappaqua, which is in Westchester County. Washington is the scene of a lot of speculation and a lot of defense by members of Congress, the Democratic Party, for someone who is presumed to be a presidential candidate, but has not now announced. David, a very good evening to you. I know in New York we're puzzled, and I will speak later on tonight to an information technology officer about questions needing to be answered. However, the politics of this complicates everything. How is it being treated in Washington, David, especially by members of Congress? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John, and it's a big story here. And even I'm a little surprised just because it's early in the campaign season. We're talking about a Democratic frontrunner, not a Republican frontrunner, but this thing is huge and it's blowing up, and I don't really say that often about something. I was having a conversation with a senator yesterday, and we were just talking about the nature of emails and what it means to traffic in information when you're a government official and a high-ranking government official. Now, U.S. senators, members of Congress, don't have particular rules about how they're supposed to email, what kind of servers they're supposed to use, whether they're government or they're personal. They're warned about security measures. The thing about this is that I think is so potentially big politically. It could all go away where it's so far away from the election, but the thing that it can be so big about it is that Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. So forget for a minute the guidelines that she didn't follow, apparently. She presumably was trafficking on a regular basis in very classified or very confidential information that I'm sure a lot of America's adversaries and enemies wanted to get a hold of. And we don't know yet what measures were taken, if any, to keep this stuff secure. And if you want to be commander-in-chief, I think this is a very big deal.
That would be the 3 a.m. question you're pointing to. Mary, do you have a question for David?
Well, David, this is just the second scandal in as many weeks. Last week's scandal was all about the Clinton Foundation and the fact that they were taking donations from foreign governments that may have wanted certain kinds of treatment from Mrs. Clinton while she was Secretary of State, and those donations were coming in when she was Secretary of State. So it's not just one scandal, but two. Has Washington forgotten about the first?
Well, for the moment, I think Washington's preoccupied with the second scandal because it's really, I think, a potentially much more damaging and much more pointed scandal in terms of qualifications for the job and exactly what she was doing in her position. And so it's just totally supplanted the argument about that. But I think one of the reasons why is that whatever you think about the donation to the Clinton Foundation, I think voters will sometimes just say to themselves, well, these are things that politicians do. They're not generally on the up and up, or they wouldn't be in office in the first place. But this second thing is a core competency issue.
The focus I have on this, David, is that I'm an older person. You and Mary are Gen X, and you were in university and doing the important business of becoming shrewd American citizens in the 20th century, where I was old enough to move politically through the Clinton administration. And by 1999, 2000, we were all exhausted dealing with Clinton rules. There's the right way, the wrong way, and the Clinton way, to borrow a Russian proverb. And what this particular story, Mrs. Clinton putting out a tweet last night at 11:45 p.m. East Coast time, when we were alerted to the fact that she wants my email shared with the media, is that the Clinton way of doing things exhausts political reporting. You wind up spending a lot of time talking to yourself about, is this important, or are we being are we being diverted from something we should be looking at? I'll start with you, Mary. Have you had the sense today that you are following a real story, or do you get the odd sense that this might all be cover, some sort of camouflage? That was always the sense in the 20th century.
This is a real story, John. It is ridiculous to assume that Hillary Clinton did not know that she should be using protected, secure government accounts for her emails when she was Secretary of State. And as you rightly say, the Clinton era was one scandal after another. And I think Americans are just getting reintroduced to who the Clintons are. The rules don't apply to them. The media gives them a pass, as David said. Some folks just assume that because they're politicians they do those things, but they give the Clintons an extra special pass because they're so used to the Clintons doing things that lead you to, as Peggy Noonan just posted on our site, to ask some very uncomfortable questions about their ethics and about their conduct in office.
Let me tell you how paranoid I am, David. When there's a Clinton story in front of me, I asked immediately of myself why we got this story on Tuesday when Bibi Netanyahu was before the U.S. Congress and the whole world was focused on the Iran threat. I thought, did they move this story because they knew it would be stepped on by the Iran story and therefore get not a lot of attention? Or the other way, did they move this story early before the announcement so it will be old news when they make the announcement? That's left over from the 20th century. Do either of those things connect, David, to how you see this being reported? Some sinister explanation for the timing?
Well, you can never rule it out. And if I'm Hillary Clinton and I'm doing the proper vetting of myself, like any top flight, or at least any candidate with experience would do, you look at your own skeleton before everybody else. You figure out what's likely to get out there. You get it out yourself. You get it out there early. And as I've said, as big of a deal as this thing is, and it may not really go away, we're so far away. We don't know who the Republican nominee is.
Right.
She's not even a nominee yet. And people are going to make all sorts of choices a year from now based on a whole bunch of new information and a gazillion news cycles later. So we don't really know what this is going to mean in the long run. Not yet.
David Drucker, Washington Examiner. It's snowing in Washington. Mary Kissel of the Wall Street Journal editorial page. It's snowing in New York. I'm John Batchelor.